Hi everyone, I'm Vinay Rao and I'm the head of platform engineering at Carver. And today I'm extremely excited to be presenting Carver RCG, which is the regulatory context graph, right? Um, let's get into some specifics. So far as the conversation around context graphs is concerned, the conversation has been extremely fruitful and rich in information and is also inward facing. What I mean by that is the additional nodes of information that are providing these important context to an AI agent is all information that's from within the organization. So code, schema, tickets, docs, you name it, is enriching the decision-making process of your AI agent. And this information is also available at dev time, wherein the building of the agent itself is becoming more robust as far as your internal context is concerned. But what's missing in this conversation is the external context. And regulators are the ones who are going to tell a particular business what their agent is allowed and not allowed to do. So that piece of external information does not exist today. And what we have built allows you to get access to that piece of information both at dev time as well as runtime. In our backend, we've been capturing regulators across more than 100 jurisdictions. And we so far have a corpus of more than 1,000 regulators whose updates are present in our database. So what we do at dev time is take that piece of information via a skill, and I'll demonstrate that. And we go ahead and contextualize it to your business and your product and your feature that you're developing. And we list out a simple list of do's and don'ts and present it as a .md file, which we call the regulatory.md or the rcg.md file. This can also be used at runtime once the agent is already built as a list of guardrails, and it can be inserted into your policy. So let's get into an actual demonstration. So Meridian Pay is a fictitious banking company that exists for the purposes of this demo. And here I've built a simple agent which helps customers with their queries. And for this session, I'm going to build a budget maker feature, right? So customers of FinCoach have been trying to get answer to questions like, given what I earn and spend, how much could I realistically save each month? So around this, the product team has come up with a entire feature spec and what the expectations from the functionality are. We are going to call it budgetly, what's the scope of it, what is out of scope, and such, right? So at this point, assuming that the external context via regulatory.md or rcg.md does not exist, let's go ahead and tell Claude to implement the feature, right? Can you go ahead and implement the feature called out in budget maker prd.txt? I'll pause the recording and let Claude do its thing and go ahead and implement the functionality, and we'll come back to the post-deployment conversation. All right, so Claude went ahead and built the feature out for us. So let's take a look at the feature without the regulatory context being present. As you can see, there's a budgetly button that has gotten added, and it asks for some basic information. What's your monthly take home? What's the rent, recurring bills, etc., etc. This was the intent of what needed to be built. Now let's see how the same functionality gets built when we actually include the regulatory context, right? To that effect, the implementation is fairly straightforward. We go ahead and we do Carver RCG init, and what this will do is it will go ahead and install the skill. What it will also do is it will give us the regulatory context that we just need to include into our Claude.md file. So give me 1 second and I'll go ahead and include that as well. So at this point, what has happened is I've gone ahead and included the regulatory context in Claude.md. Now we can go ahead and rerun the Claude session. So let me go ahead and clear out the context here. And once the context is cleared, right? So the instructions fairly straightforward. Just make sure that you're in the right folder. Run the RCG skill, which we just installed. The PRD that we are going to be building this feature against is here. And any additional context is present in these documents, right? Now, let's go ahead and run this. All right. So what happened when I ran this particular command is it went ahead and ran the RCG skill. And as a part of the RCG skill, it did a quick PRD review and it came up with a regulatory assessment of what it did well and what were the gaps that it noticed. It noticed a few gaps in terms of the data posture, the decisioning posture, and the flow direction. And it also noticed a few regulators that were present and the recency of expectation from the regulatory standpoint. And it came up with a few recommendations. It said that, hey, listen, as far as the gap is concerned, that, the PRD is talking about discarding of information as the session ends, but it does not explicitly expose that information via UX. How should I go about it? The decision posture from a pre-submit standpoint requires the user to acknowledge that they know that this is purely an information that's being shared, and you cannot be held liable, and so on and so forth. So with all of these questions, I've gone ahead and responded with what my expectations are. I said, let's go ahead and patch the first gap and the second gap, and we can scope out the third gap that you called out. And I think you should add one more regulator. You only spoke of 2 regulators and, other pieces of information. So let's go ahead and send this off and, let the skill do its job as far as implementation is concerned. So here's what happened since we confirmed that the skill needs to go ahead and complete. It went ahead and patched the gaps that were identified in terms of including acknowledgements or the UX and so on and so forth. It went ahead and pulled information that's relevant to the business, the product, and the feature. And it went ahead and created a regulatory.md, which is the physical manifestation of the regulatory context graph. And here it went ahead and included a list of do's and don'ts, what from a disclosure and consent standpoint, from a data handling standpoint, from a AI decision scoping standpoint, and so on and so forth. And each one was attributed back to an actual update that was provided from the regulators. And as a consequence of this, when the feature was actually implemented, like I said, go ahead and implement the functionality, it completed its implementation, and let's see the outcome that was generated. So when you look at the outcome, I just refresh the page. There's a new button, which is Budgetly with RCG. And now when you go ahead and open it, you notice that there is an actual disclosure that comes up front. We are going to be asking users about their income and their spending patterns and so on. So we need to be sure that we satisfy the regulatory expectation of all the necessary disclosures. So when I go ahead and say, I understand, let's go ahead and continue, you notice that A, the disclosure itself was present, and B, the get coaching button no longer is directly available unless and until I consent to it. So we've already seen the difference between what used to be, which is Budgetly, which was, hey, give me the information, I'll go ahead and pass it along. The feature and functionality was just perfectly fine. It's just that from a regulatory standpoint, simply because we're dealing with people's information about their income and their expenditure, the safer and the more compliant outcome is what got built because we provided that external context. So just to do a very quick capture of what we just went through, the product manager went ahead and defined the PRD and the scope of expectations from the products and feature that they want. We went ahead and did a Carver RCG init to pull the skill in. Once the skill was in, we went ahead and ran the skill. It identified a few gaps. It pulled actual regulatory updates relevant to this function, feature, organization. It then went ahead and translated those outcomes into a regulatory or an rcg.md file, which was then presented as an added context in the agents.md, or in my case, Claude.md file. So I simply said, hey, look at rcg.md for any regulatory pieces of information. From there on, when the implementation happened, it added the necessary compliance by design, compliance by construction outcomes. And like I mentioned initially, this same information is relevant as far as at runtime also, because any agentic action can now be passed through the list of do's and don'ts before it qualifies as well, it being a compliant response or not. With that, I'd like to end my demo. Thank you so much for listening.